I think she's very inspiring. This is the way I would like to work with my clients, and her words were pure inspiration for me.
The most amazing was the way she speaks. I think I haven't heard of someone speak so eloquently before, which allows us to really receive that information.
I love her thoughts and concrete ideas how to transform events.
My impression of Pigalle was that be educated in this area. The way that she speaks is quite emotional and gets us to really understand how her strategy and her theory applies to our conversations with our potential clients.
The importance of emotion and that they play such an important role also in long-term memory and what the role of the brain, this was a bit new to me.
There was actually a few things that were unexpected and surprising to hear, especially in terms of the sequence of the behavior that we need to look at. I think a lot of the times when it comes to the delegates themselves, we're thinking of the behavior first, but really understanding that it needs to start from the feeling and the emotions first. That was definitely a surprise and something that I want to explore more about.
It was very good to hear that you have to start from the end, so from the impact, and then you can build around that.
There is definitely one thing, probably a few things that I would take away for my work, and that definitely starting from the end and flipping it on its head, where we're focusing on the emotion first and then using the budgets and the timeline more as a guide instead of the focus.
I would try now to understand what is the target, was it the goal of every event, and try to start with that point and to build the emotion around with my clients.
In terms of the buyer process and the decision-making process, where we're focusing on budgets, being events people, we're focusing on budgets instead of the emotion first.
I like the structured approach, and I'm happy to read the building blocks of design, maybe to get even a bit better structure into my work of designing events.
And let me introduce us. So the main question I have, what should be different after an event than before? That is the main question I have. And over 20 years I've been asking that, but to be honest, the answer often is for organizations, they just simply don't know. And they plan events, but they don't plan for impact. I first came across my guest at the World Experience Organization last year in London. You spoke about the most powerful way to capture hearts and minds, which is through emotions. And this obviously has captured me ever since. The key question is how? So let's find out together. As founder of the School of Experience Design building blocks author, and one of the people who has done more than almost anyone to give our field a scientific foundation, I welcome Pigalle Tibakoli.
Thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to be here with you today and with all these lovely people sat around us as well for this live recording.
Awesome. So Pigalle, you've described the first event production you did back in 2005 for the Victoria and Albert Theatre Museum in London. And the audience was suddenly stopped by just being an audience, and you couldn't say who's playing the piano, dancing with the performers. It all was upside down and changed, and you couldn't tell who was actually performing and who was the audience. What did you understand at that moment about live experiences?
So to give some context and background to answer this question, I'm going to take you back through the mists of time. And originally, I studied theatre and I worked on big West End shows. And what I really learned and really started my passion from working in theatre was I became fascinated about removing the stage, about making the audience the central protagonist and how we can make direct connections with them through that. So after I spent about 5 years in theatre, I then went on in 2005 to do my first event production, and it was for the V&A Theatre Museum in London, and I took over the whole building. I created an immersive story world. I invited the audience to become characters, there was a dress theme, and it was the first event production that I had done, so I had huge ambitions by taking over the whole building. I didn't start small, but there was this magical moment that happened in the middle of the event that I compared to alchemy. And what happened was, in the beginning, the audience arrived and they were being passive spectators. They were observing, they were watching the productions, and they were quite polite and well behaved. And then halfway through, this magical moment happened where the audience were fired up and they suddenly jumped up. They started spontaneously dancing. They started pushing performers out of the way and playing the piano. Strangers started talking to each other. People started interacting and mixing. And I realized that this was a really special moment, because this was when the audience became the central protagonist and the story became about them. And the reason that I compare it to alchemy is because alchemy was originally an ancient philosophical practice before you could turn base metal into gold. And as a philosophy, what they said was, if you were to become an alchemist, you had to spend years of your life transforming and becoming your better self until you could self-actualize into your full potential. And only then, once you had fully transformed into your best self, could you then carry out the process of alchemy to change base metal into gold. And so I compare this magical moment to the audience, where they arrive in their base material form as the person they currently are. And by the time they leave, I want them to have transformed into the gold and the potential of who they could be going forward. I want them to have transformed and be changed by the time they leave. And that's why I then went in pursuit of really refining the techniques, the methods, how to actually intentionally create this transformation and change to take place.
Wonderful, because connecting the dots here from before after, that's totally my topic. And I wonder, like your story, you have been on a quite interesting journey, working in very different fields like tech, science, but then also fashion. None of these are very obvious steps. Like, what were you actually following in that?
This is a really good question, and I'm going to give you a little trajectory of my journey to be with you here today. So originally I studied theatre, I worked backstage on West End shows, and I realised that much as I had this passion for removing the stage, most of theatre back then was actually still quite traditional. The audience was passive, they'd sit as spectators in a seat, very much as we are here today, and then the actors would be on the stage. And I really wanted to break those boundaries and be more innovative and exploratory in what I did. So I moved into the world of fashion. So I studied a fashion degree and I worked 10 years in the fashion industry, including being a creative assistant for designers like Alexander McQueen. So I really went for innovative designers to work with. And then I spent 5 years establishing and running my own fashion label, selling globally to boutiques worldwide. And then from running my business and being 10 years in fashion, I then ended up working in the world of science, but I worked as a creative producer for 15 years, and my specialism was curating collaborations between artists and scientists. And then that brought me to the world of experience design, because I started producing in 2005, and then I got invited in 2012 to start teaching at Central St. Martin's, a leading art and design university in London. And because I had never taught before, and because the topic was called experience design, and because I was so busy as a producer, I obviously said yes. I love a challenge. And through teaching experience design, I realized I'm doing something that has a name, and I'm doing something that has value for businesses, for organizations, for employees, for public audiences. And so I became really passionate to also figure out these 3 spheres of worlds that I've been in, from theatre to fashion to working with scientists and now with experience design. What unites them all? What is my narrative through all of this? So I have spent many years considering this, and I realised that actually what sparks me and drives me is I feel there is so much potential in everyone. in everyone listening to this podcast, everyone watching and listening here today, being with Chris. And I feel that's such a shame not to tap into this incredible potential that each and every one of us has. And I realize this is what drives me, no matter the industry that I'm in. Everything I've been doing my whole life has been about activating this incredible potential within people. Because I really believe that when we tap into our potential, we then become empowered and motivated to realize we could live differently, we could live more fully, we could make different decisions. And ultimately, this empowers us to thrive in the lives and the work we do. And then that resonates and ripples out, because if we're more empowered and thriving, that will ripple out and affect and influence the people around us. It will affect the communities that we connect with, and then it will ripple out wider for society as a whole to thrive. So I believe that that's the narrative thread, that no matter the industry, or medium or platform or what I do, ultimately I'm trying to be the bridge that helps people connect to themselves, to release theirs and everyone here today's incredible potential to thrive.
What a wonderful journey so far. And clever as you are, you always measured for your impact during all these years. And I mean, most corporate events, they wouldn't know how to measure or what they measure. So what did you measure? And maybe is there some interesting data, and what did it tell you?
Yeah, so measurement of impact is very important to me, because I don't care just about creating a solution, creating a design, creating an event, a product, a service. What I care about is the effect, the change, the alchemical transformation. Did it actually deliver that? Otherwise, there's no point of the bit before it. So because I worked for 15 years for arts, cultural and scientific organisations, most of the events that I did were publicly funded by people like the Wellcome Trust, by the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Medical Research Council, with clients like the Science Museum. So they needed to know, did I deliver impact? And the kind of impact they were looking for was change in emotions, changes in perspectives and shifts. Did people become curious about the scientific topic? And the impact and change of behaviour they wanted afterwards were, do people want to go and find out more about this topic, this scientific research? So I actually worked with professional evaluators for almost every single one of my events over 15 years. And they produced extensive in-depth reports. And what it involved was at all my events, they attended and they observed, we created a strategy beforehand for the types of, we defined first of all, what is the changes we want people to have? And we were very specific about them. If it's change of thought, exactly what change of thought? So it's really important to define, so you can create then the metrics to capture the definition of the changes you want to make. So we'd create a whole list. Maybe there's 10 different things that we want to track and measure. That would then allow us to think, which methods do we use? So some of the methods were direct observation of visual expressions, listening, what were people saying. I would also integrate into every event measurement methods. So I'd always have an opening activity that was quite fun and playful, but it would invite people to contribute their current understanding of the topic. And then at the end, I'd have another playful activity, which was part of the storyline, which was then, what have they discovered now? And that would be a direct marker and a measure of, did they learn something new? How much? How little? I would also design the emotional journey of my audience, and I would give that to the evaluators, and they would track that planned emotional journey exactly at all the touch points that I have specified to see how high or low, did it hit that mark, did it not? If it did, why? If it did, why not? So I would get these huge evaluation reports, and because I'm a real nerd and I love to find out the why, and did something work? If it didn't, how could I improve it? So over 15 years, I learned from doing and working directly with the audience. And every event, I could improve my techniques. I could develop them further based on what I was continuously learning from these reports as well.
I have very practical takeaways. One is have a base questionnaire before the end, so you have like the level where people start from, and then you can ask the same question afterwards, so you see the difference. So just have that question before, after. That's helpful. And the other thing I also do with emotion, as a director of shows, I have my running order, and what I do beforehand, I just put an emotion next to the topic which I want to achieve. Because that really helps me, but also like the light designer or anyone, to understand what is it we actually want to trigger, right? So at least there's a very basic step without...
And I would say that I don't like questionnaires and I don't like surveys. They give you the worst results, and it's the technique that most people use. And the reason is, none of us like to fill in surveys, right? And they look really boring, we're in a rush, it's getting in the way. And often people will answer what they think you want to hear because they want to be helpful and they just want to get on with everything else they want to do. So I design the whole event and the experience very, very carefully as one integrated story, be it live, be it hybrid, have technology in it, but it's all seamless. So that beginning point of entry when they come into the space, it's a playful activity as the beginning of the story they're entering into. So they don't know that it's for me and I'm going to analyze it as qualitative measurements later. And I have things, playful activities all the way through, even on a simple indicator of engagement. If one activity hardly anyone draws or hardly anyone contributes, that shows low engagement. On a very simple basis, if we count the amount of drawings, that's already a metric of higher engagement, let alone the things they say or the things we record. So it just requires a bit more imagination to think about and to be really specific. What are we trying to measure, and what would that look like? What would that sound like? What things should people be saying? And then that, if you use your imagination and think a bit harder and plan in advance, there are many ways you can measure this. And the best time to measure is during the experience, not as an afterthought later. Interview and send surveys later or ask people to reply by email. That's the worst moment. You really want to capture it during the moment it's actually happening.
In other words, everyone book Tiga. But coming on science and talking about your structure behind it. So you've built this whole design system on one principle, emotion first. Walk us through the neuroscience there. What happens actually in our brains when an experience truly lands versus when it doesn't?
Yeah, fantastic. So I worked 15 years with scientists. And they were obviously doing their scientific research in their science fields. But since 2012, starting to teach experience design, even though most people didn't know what experience design was yet, and much less thinking about what's the science behind this, I was already thinking, I don't just want to have a feel or an instinct about why something works, I actually want to know what's happening within us. So since 2012, if I could just move to the next slide, wonderful. So since 2012, I've been researching, I've been working with scientists, I've been reading books on neuroscience. So I've been doing all of this work for you all today to crunch it down to become simpler to understand. So when it comes to changing behavior or actually creating real tangible transformation, we have behavioral scientists, behavioral economists, who are spending many years developing theories and models for this. And a very popular model, which I'm sure all of you here today are familiar with, is the idea of changing the way people think, then you change the way they feel, and then you can change the way they do. But real people don't behave the way that I want them to do in my lovely detailed spreadsheets or in my perfectly designed emotional journey. So I like to say that I walked the walk before I talked the talk. And that's from 15 years in the field, literally in muddy fields at festivals, taking over buildings, doing pop-ups, installations, supper clubs. Over 15 years, I did every type of format, from one-to-one encounters to 30,000 people or more. And I learned from the audience. The audience taught me. It wasn't a one-way dialogue where I've got something to show them. They showed me how real people behave in unexpected ways. And it's through people and them literally transforming in front of me that I realized that actually, if you want long-term impact and transformation, it's their emotions that's the most powerful lever of all. And so I recommend for long-term change to do feel, think and do. And so I went on a quest to find out more about emotions. And I realized that in the world of business and the world of science, emotions have a really bad reputation. People don't like to deal with emotions. They're messy, they're complicated. People do things they shouldn't be doing with emotions. It's really hard to manage and learn about. And in business, we're told, be logical, be rational, do not use emotions. They get in the way of making sensible decisions. And in the world of science, there is a bit of hierarchy where there's hard science, like things like physics, neuroscience, being a brain surgeon, but things like emotions, psychology, the senses, they're thought of as soft science. And people aren't that keen to go and study in those areas. So I thought, from what I was learning from real human beings in front of me for 15 years, that I want to reclaim emotions and actually explain and the real reason why they have this powerful effect on us. So it's not just me that started to find this out. There are other incredible scientists. So there's a Nobel Prize winning psychologist who unfortunately passed away a few years ago called Daniel Kahneman. And he, in his groundbreaking research, he found out that when people are making decisions, actually only about 5% or less of the time, it's their rational, logical thinking that is helping them make those decisions. And actually 95% of the time or more, it's the unconscious, instinctive, emotional aspects that are driving their decisions, and then they happen to think logically afterwards. And this has been groundbreaking. He won a Nobel Prize for this, and it completely upturned what neuroscientists thought about the role of emotions versus conscious, rational thinking. And so it also sent me on a quest, because I became very curious. I mentioned I'm quite a nerd about these things. And I was like, yes, but I still want to know, what part of the brain is this all happening in? So what I discovered was that when we're having rational, logical thinking, or when we're hearing information that's being led by numbers or data sets, this all goes into the front part of where our forehead is, which is known as the prefrontal cortex. And this is where conscious, rational thought is processed. Now, something really interesting happens when we receive emotionally rich information. And what happens, and this is something we have no control over, what happens is emotionally rich information comes in and it ignores the prefrontal cortex. It completely ignores conscious, rational areas of processing. And instead, it goes directly in. And if you put your finger to the back of your head and you feel the indent in the back of your head and you imagine your finger going into the middle of your brain, inside there is a really small gland, and it's called the amygdala. And this information directly goes to the amygdala, which is where emotions are processed and stored. And the amazing thing about the amygdala is it has a best friend, and its best friend lives next door. And its best friend is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where memories are stored. And the incredible thing about them being best friends is they have this great relationship. So when you are having a great experience, the amygdala fires up and processes and stores this emotion. And it immediately tells the hippocampus, hey, form a memory of this emotion. And then in the future, when you're remembering back to this great experience you had, the hippocampus fires up and it speaks back to the amygdala and it says, hey, retrieve the same emotions you were having as if you're back there in time. So emotions not only are creating memories in the moment, but they're also forming this long form memory that will retrieve and bring back those emotions to people for years to come afterwards.
I mean, just also wondering or remembering on Daniel Kahneman and his peak end rule that really highlights that people remember the peak moment and also the very last moment. And that for me as director is very important to also remember a great person.
And I'd just like to summarize as well that all of that research that I did and all the learnings I made over the years and directly learning from people, I've squeezed into a very handy building block method, which I call the emotion change equation. And I'm going to share it with you today, which is changing behavior is the hardest thing to do because humans don't want to change. So I say, even though it's in all of our design and briefs to change behavior, I say instead, don't try and change behavior. Put all your time, effort and resources into first changing the way people feel. Because if you change their emotions from the beginning of the experience, the event, the communication campaign that you've created, they will then start to reduce their internal barriers. Their mind will open up. They go into what's known as an open, creative mindset. And what will happen is you can then introduce elements that are logical, that are data-driven and information-based. Because then their minds are open and they're willing to consider shifts in perspective, changes of thought. And if you've effectively changed their emotions and shifted their thoughts, a natural outcome will be changes in behavior. And if you want that behavior change to last a long time, that will depend on the quality and depth of emotions and thoughts that you have changed for the length of time that behavior change will be.
Wonderful. Which is, in my corporate experience, often straight the opposite. So people do first focus on what people should think, and then they hope that emotion might follow, which is totally the wrong way and approach. So I wonder if you would put this into like the next leadership meeting corporate has. How would it look like to design first for the emotion?
So in terms of designing for an emotion-first approach, I have written a guidebook with 8 fundamental building blocks, and I will be sharing with you another building block shortly. But I would say that a really important key to sparking people's emotions is to make the story about them. In a leadership conference or in a brand experiential activation or at conferences, people are so busy trying to tell you about them, their brand, their product, their service. And intrinsically, it's not what we don't really care about them and their job or making them profit or being seen as a walking wallet to open up and give them more money. It's not what really matters to us. So our job is actually to think about our audience. What matters to them? What do we do to really understand them? What's going on in their inner world, their intrinsic motivations? And then create a storyline that's about them, where they get to be the central protagonist and they go on a journey throughout and they find out more about themselves, and then how the product, service, leadership training can then help and benefit them to grow and thrive.
Well, thank you for specifying. I mean, with this book, we all need to dig into, but rather than just go through all different 8 blocks, what would you say do organizations skip most, and what does that cost them?
So I'm going to zoom into block 3 to help answer that question. So I'm going to describe the common way when people receive a brief that they tackle this brief. And then I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you relate to this. So I'm first going to describe it. So when people get a design brief, the first thing they normally look at is, What are the constraints? What are the restrictions? How much budget is there? Usually too little. How much time have I been asked to deliver this? Usually even less. And how much of my staff can I allocate? Well, even less than that. So we start from a really tight position of what are these limitations? What are these restrictions? And then we're put in a room, given half an hour and told, come up with a great idea that's going to be effective and deliver the results that we want. And we're all sitting there trying really hard to come up with a really great idea with these really difficult constraints. And then we've got these little tight ideas. And then once it's output, we cross our fingers and hope it's going to be effective. How many people can relate to having to approach a design challenge in this direction? If you could raise your hands, if you can relate to this. Okay, fantastic. So I'm here to help you and say that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this difficult, this random, this keeping your fingers crossed. What it can be is if we, instead of hoping for the results at the end, I'm going to reverse engineer this. And I'm going to say, let's start with the ending. Let's put the ending at the beginning. And let's ask ourselves a very important question. Why are we designing this? And why should anyone care about it? And let's spend a little time at the beginning so we can go fast later. Let's take a little bit of time and let's define what is that impact? What is that transformation and change that we want to bring about? Because if we can really clearly define that at the beginning, that creates a strategic framework and roadmap from which we can then say, this emotion change equation that I described, we can then say, if it's this impact and change we want to bring about, exactly what emotions should they feel to lead to that impact? What sorts of thoughts and shifts of perspective should they have to lead to that impact? And what kinds of actions do they need to carry out? And only then, when you've defined all of those steps, finally you can come to, okay, what ideas do we need? And it's really quick and easy to come up with the ideas because you've already got what I call a transformation strategy framework that's already leading you, and then it becomes really easy to think of what those ideas are, which will be really effective to then truly capture hearts and minds, to then get the results and the outputs that you want.
Oh, wonderful. So I wanted just to make it practical. If you get a brief, and I mean, the question is if the intention really is for change. I mean, we all want change, but no one turns up for change, right? So to figure out if this format, this event can really, this experience can really be transformative, is there maybe one question you have to challenge a brief or figure out and find if someone really wants to get there?
So I've also worked a lot with commercial clients and creative agencies, advertising agencies. So in the commercial world, the reason it's called a creative brief is because the brief is brief. It's usually one side A4, if you're lucky, two sides A4. I can see some people nodding to that. And the problem is that is too brief to spend all the time and money and resources to then go and design a solution. So what I like to do is then go and talk to the client and have some more in-depth conversation with them. Because the most common thing they usually say is the aim and results that we want is increased sales, increased KPIs. Now the thing about that is that's not an aim in itself, that's actually an outcome. If you've achieved the design and created transformation, then you'll have increased sales, increased KPIs. But that in itself isn't actually an aim. So what I talk to them about is reframing it as transformation and impact, and actually talking with them, because they've usually not thought that long. They're just thinking about the experience itself. But my question to them is, what's that long-term change you want them to have after that initial time and moment and interaction and touch points, so that you're building a long-term relationship, that they come back to you and they want more. And by asking these questions, we can flesh out that creative brief to no longer be so brief. And I work in partnership, in collaboration with them, to then expand that into much more detail. I also include more research about the audience, because usually it's only a paragraph, not based on very good data normally. So I'm very passionate about audience research. because there's a lot of assumptions about thinking we know who the audience are versus who they really are, and finding that out so we can really base the definition of and identifying the transformation and change that's not just what we want, but that's meaningful to the audience that are coming. So I hope that helps to answer that.
Another follow-up question. So if a chief HR officer is planning an offsite, leadership offsite, what would you say is the single design decision that separates an experience people are still talking about weeks after, then rather have forgotten it next day?
So another really great question, because so what if it's great, right? Like, we're not here today to just make something great for that moment. So another common thing that takes place, there's an English expression called throwing the kitchen sink. So we're all passionate about what we do, we really care, we want to make sure everybody has a great time. So the tendency is to throw everything at it, make sure that everything is brilliant, let's bring more technology, let's make more great things happen within it. But how many people go home and say, oh my goodness, I wore this amazing VR headset and I just can't stop thinking about it? Or who goes home and say, I saw a poster and it made me so emotional, it brought back memories of my childhood, makes me feel so nostalgic. So the thing is about all the elements that we use to design an event or a product or a service, these are all external elements that take place outside of us. And as humans, we don't intrinsically care about those. Those are our tools. And they're not the aim in itself. They are the external elements, they are our tools to then activate an experience to take place, and an experience takes place within people. And when those tools are designed effectively, they set off this alchemical chain reaction within people, and they have an emotion change equation happen within them. And the story doesn't finish there, because so what if they've had an amazing time? We want to have this long-term impact afterwards. So if we have used those tools, those external elements well, and it's set off this internal experience and changes of emotions, thoughts and behavior, if we've done that effectively for a long time afterwards, for days, for weeks, for years afterwards, they should still be remembering it in their hippocampus, firing up their amygdala as if they're having the same emotions there back in time, which continues to motivate and activate them to continue that transformation and change to carry on in their lives afterwards.
Wonderful. And just also another observation, I mean, most of the events we all produce, they're all well done and they're sharp on point. But then we have all these feedbacks coming in, and in the end, they don't leave trace. Where would you say, how would you describe why we have that gap?
So I'm going to call on my best friend, an ancient Chinese philosopher called Confucius, to help answer this. So it's all very well us sitting here and speaking to the listeners on your podcast, speaking to the wonderful people here today. But I've been talking about not being a passive spectator. So right now you're all being passive listeners or passive spectators. This is not the best form of learning or the best form of you going away and never forgetting this. So what Confucius says is, if I hear, I'm more likely to forget what I've been hearing. If I see it, I'm more likely to remember it. But ultimately, if I do it, I will really understand. So I'm also really passionate about hands-on active learning. And the way that this takes place is by actually doing it yourselves. So from producing for 15 years, where I made the audience the protagonist, I made them actively participate and be involved and do things throughout all of those events, I now go and teach, I train, I educate global brands, organizations, leaders and their teams. And hopefully these images don't look like traditional training, because I like to be unlike any other type of trainer out there, because I like to show a model or a method, but I immediately follow it up with a group collaborative exercise activity, because when they're actually doing it and trying it out, it doesn't go as straightforward as it looks nice and neat on a page or on a slide. And in the moment of doing, they can ask questions. They can find out, oh, this is a bit harder to do than I realized. And we can work through it together collaboratively until it really lands and they have these aha moments. And they go, oh my goodness, now I understand. By doing it and trying it out and practicing it here, I know now I can go back to my desk, I can go back to my team meeting, and I can immediately apply this, and I can see the difference this will make to the way that I work to get more effective results.
So true, I can feel that, yeah. So many more questions, but maybe just one on what we all experienced in the last couple of years with digital and hybrid events. What is missing that only can be done in person?
So you've probably realized by now I like to give unexpected answers. So what I like to say when you have digital or hybrid events, the thing you don't get that you can only get in person, when we're all here today at IMEX, and this is what's happening already for you all and going to continue over the next days, it's the unexpected, unplanned for connections that you make with other people in conversation. They don't call it a water cooler moment for nothing. So I actually design intentionally for gaps in the training I do, in the events I did, because again, for a little bit of science behind this, in Gestalt psychology, they talk about how our brains don't like gaps. They call it closure. And when there are gaps, instinctively, intuitively, as Daniel Kahneman noticed with System 1, System 2, and how we're mainly unconsciously driven, what happens is we jump in to fill those gaps. And we fill those gaps either with our imagination if we're on our own, or we fill those moments and gaps in time by looking for someone and something to do or someone to talk to. So I would always not throw the kitchen sink at everything and have these precious moments of gaps, because most of you will be leaving the next few days of IMEX and you'll be going back talking about the unexpected conversation you had with someone in between the amazing talks and delegates and things you had on your list to do, or you'll talk about the person you sat next with and how you struck up an incredible connection with them. And these human moments that are no one can fully plan for to take place, but we can create space and opportunity for them to happen. These are what we can't replicate fully digitally or fully hybrid, because we need to be there in person for these unexpected magical moments to take place.
I believe you're all for it. Thank you for it.
Everyone will do.
Yes. So harvesting our very rich conversation, and I'm sure there's much left, but let's try to figure and digest 3 sentences that we can all take away. Maybe you can help to create these sentences. So first, the one thing that separates experience that impress from an experience that transform.
So apart from starting with emotions, the really important thing about the way that you want to evoke emotions is make the audience, your clients, your guests, the central protagonist of the story, and make the story about them. When the story becomes about them, that's when their emotions are evoked, and that's when they'll form long-lasting memories.
And then second, the design decision most organizations skip and what it costs them.
I know we're all in a rush, and I know we're working to tight budgets, but please go slow at the beginning so you can go fast later. Spend a little bit of time thinking about the end. What is that impact? Define that transformation. Create a strategic roadmap from which you can then ideate. That will make ideation, production go faster, and you won't be crossing your fingers and hoping it will work. You will have a really clear, defined, set roadmap to getting the maximum impact and effectiveness that you're aiming for.
Nice. And then thirdly, what physical presence makes possible that no digital format can replicate.
So it's these wonderful, unexpected connections and conversations that you will continue to have over the next few days, that you will go back and tell your colleagues and your friends about. It's the unexpected moments of humans coming together, and that's what makes humans so brilliant. That's why I love working for humans.
Wonderful. Pigalle, so from emotion to impact, what would you say should be different for all of us listeners now after the conversation than before?
I really hope the change that I may have helped plant a seed for you all today, because no one can really change another person, because everyone has to be the doers and the architects of their own change. But I really hope I've planted a seed to salvage and save the reputation of emotions, and to realize the hard science behind why emotions aren't soft and why they're the most powerful lever to effectively bring about transformation and long-term change.
I took away feeling the alchemy. That was really strong. And then feel, think, do in that order, please. And then I love the framework. So I'm really looking forward to dig into that 8 building blocks.
And I have a final takeaway for you, Chris.
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. So I have a copy of my guidebook I would love to gift you. And I'd love to know, when you have a moment after these busy days to read and digest it, I'd love to know your thoughts about it all.
Absolutely. We'll continue on that conversation. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks for all of you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here today.
And,